Greetings, everyone. We're very happy to have all of you here today for today's event titled A Discussion on Black Lives, Protest, and Democracy, hosted by the Ash Center at Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Ming Francis, and I'm a visiting associate professor of public policy here at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Washington. We look forward to a lively discussion, so please contribute questions in the chat box on YouTube, and we will get to a few of them after the formal presentations. A few things to note: we will be recording today's session for educational purposes, and everyone who registered will receive a link which can be shared, and we encourage you to share that with others. The Ash Center has additional programming over the summer and hopes to keep everyone engaged. All right, so right now is a defining moment in history, and gathered with us today on Zoom are three experts that can help us better understand the present moment. And if what you hear surprises you, enrages you, or perhaps if you disagree, I want you to sit with why it does. But I don't just want you to sit with it, I want you to do something. Because part of what I think the present moment has highlighted is not just how much needs to be done, but also how much needs to be learned, and a whole group of people that need to be listened to in a way that they have not before. I also want to acknowledge that we are gathered here on this Zoom during a very, very difficult time. It's been 2 weeks of intense protests, which were ignited by the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. I want to introduce our guest very briefly. We have a lot to get to today, and with not enough time. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will speak. First, we have Leah Rigueur. She's an associate professor at Harvard Kennedy School and at Brandeis University. We have Kaneesha Johnson, who is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Government here at Harvard University. And with us, we also have Dr. Rhea, who is a pediatrician at the Palo Alto Medical Foundation. Before we get to our esteemed panelists, I want to provide 5 minutes of historical context to understand the present moment, in part because I'm always struck by how much people do not know about the long history of racial violence in this country. So a lot of my work that I've done in the past has focused on the NAACP's organizing around racial violence in the first quarter of the 20th century. And I want to get to that in a moment. My current book project, however, examines the political and economic reconstitution of the American South after the Civil War. And what is so interesting about this time, right? What is so interesting about the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s is how immediately after the Civil War, how most Southern states, they passed new laws in terms of the meeting of their first state legislature with a specific focus of wanting to entrap Black people again. So they passed new laws, and then they practiced discriminatory policing, in which you see all across the South. And again, directly after the Civil War in this country, is you see in terms of jail and prison populations expanding dramatically. You also see the building of new state penitentiaries all across the South. So in terms of, and I say that to say that to understand kind of the anger and the frustration around policing in 2020 means to go back, not just in terms of the 60s, but to push that back even more. What happens, because it is clear, at least for Black people at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, that the most important civil rights issue is racial violence. That before African Americans can go to school, before they can own a house or vote, they have to have the right to live. And so Ida B. Wells is organizing around lynching and mob violence at the end of the 19th century. And she really raises alarm in this country about what is happening to Black people in this country by actors of the state, as well as by private actors. The NAACP picks this up in the beginning part of the 20th century, and that is really the centerpiece of the agenda, is protection of Black lives from lynching and mob violence by state actors and by white vigilantes. And they launched this massive, beautiful, wonderful, important campaign in this country around racial violence, demonstrations in the street. They try to pass an anti-lynching bill in Congress. Why can't we still pass that? They are also in the courts, in federal courts. There's this important Supreme Court decision called Moore v. Dempsey that the NAACP is behind, that is passed in 1923. They are also trying to get the attention of Woodrow Wilson, right, I know, and Warren G. Harding in this earlier period, and they want both presidents to make a statement condemning lynching. And I think what is really interesting, and the reason why I always highlight this moment, is because Black people have been fighting for the right to live forever. All of American history is filled with stories about Black people trying to live. And if you don't know that, you have to think about why you don't know that history. And it's not to shame people, right? But it's to think about the differences in the lives and the stories that Black people tell their children and that other people tell their children. The other reason why I think it's really important to understand that racial terrorism is part of the way Black people live life is because sometimes for many, it's right there on the surface. Sometimes it's not on the surface, but for many of us, it's always simmering below, right beneath the surface. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of that historical context in terms of to understand the present moment, because, and this is the last thing that I will say, because it's not just about police violence, right? It's about so many different institutions in this country that have failed Black people. And it's about also, as well as corporations, it's about how we continue to marginalize Black lives in the way that we live, that many Americans live life. So in this moment, I really want us to think about the ways that our actions have, and our institutions, right? Our institutions have contributed to the unmattering of Black lives. And I want us, especially during this talk, as you listen to these panelists, and as you move forward throughout your day and throughout your week, think about the actions that you can take as an individual and as a community, and also in your institutions about how to make Black lives matter. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Leah Wright Rigueur. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Francis, for that great background and history. First, I want to say thank you to everybody who's listening out there. I also want to say thank you to the Ash Center, also to Dr. Rhea Boyd and Dr. Kaneesha Grant for participating in this and putting it together. I think now is a time where we actually have to speak out even more than before. That, in fact, one of the things that we should be doing, and I haven't really noticed this very much in larger conversations about the protests, about the moment that we're in right now, is actually providing a context, a larger context in history for what is happening and why it's happening right now. So one of the things that I wanted to start off with is really acknowledging the fact that so much has changed in the last 4 years. You know, one way to kind of pinpoint this is think about 4 years ago, most people could not, except for Black people, but most people could not say the phrase Black Lives Matter, right? That was actually an extraordinarily hard thing for people to do. Right? We were having presidential debates, right, where people were like, of course Black Lives Matter because all lives matter, right? It was a qualifying statement. And now, right, we have all races, this multiracial movement of people chanting in the street, including even a certain senator from Utah, right, who was a presidential candidate in 2012, chanting the phrase Black Lives Matter, right, in defense of justice. So I just want to point that out to highlight just how different the moment is that we are in right now, to acknowledge that. You know, there have been over 140 protests across 50 states and territories in America, more than 50 states and territories in America, including big cities, small counties, towns, all over. And there have been hundreds of global protests in solidarity. And I bring this up because I think it signals how important the moment is. I think, you know, if we're talking about optimistic and kind of visions for outlook, I think it signals that we are on the verge of something transformative, and that it is spurred in large part and completely underlined by the idea of Black protest and also the actionable items of Black protesters and this longer historical legacy of Black protest. So what I want to do now is talk about what exactly is this moment? How did we even get here? And then why is this something bigger right now? The first part of this is really thinking about all of these incidents happening back to back to back to back. right? The nation is still mourning the death of Ahmaud Arbery. We're still jogging in remembrance, in memory of Ahmaud Arbery. We're still learning the deaths of Breonna Taylor, right? The horrific death at the hands of the police. When we get this gruesome, absolutely gruesome and horrific death over Memorial Day weekend. So we haven't even finished mourning, actually grieving and mourning. And we can't mourn because we are in quarantine and it is in the midst of a pandemic. But we haven't even finished mourning when we get this nearly 9-minute video of state-sanctioned murder against a man who in his dying breaths cries out for his mother who has been dead for 2 years. That is powerful, it is transformative, and it is a wake-up call for many people because there's no longer any way to avoid or pretend or wear blinders. And I know some of my colleagues later in the panel are gonna talk a bit about how this quarantine shapes, but one thing that we might think about is that the quarantine actually turns off the ability of many people to escape or deny what is actually happening right in front of them. Now, but for Black Americans, right, this is not new. This is actually a reminder that we are without sanctuary, right? That we are without sanctuary, that this is not unique. At no other time in history has there not been a moment like that. And I'm gonna repeat that because it's really important. At no other time in history has there not been a moment like this. And by that, I mean, Black people have always had to reckon with these forces because Black people, as Dr. Megan Francis pointed out in her opening remarks, have always been under assault. So it's not simply a reaction to Ahmaud, Breonna, and Floyd. It's not simply righteous rage at one particular incident. These protests emerge from a longer history of Black Americans being subjected to brutality of a racist state and unequal institutions. So it's rage at being denied access to the American dream, to being historically and continuously excluded from the promise of American citizenship, and to being exploited by a system that consistently plunders and takes from Black people. So I want to point out a couple of specifics here that I think the other panelists are going to elaborate on. So the protests we see now are the protests that we can look at historically are about the overlapping failures of America. So we're talking about a system of capitalism that has not worked for Black and brown people and that has left millions unemployed and underemployed, right? And that's historically and right now. Black people are experiencing the highest rate of unemployment in the country, right? George Floyd was in Minneapolis looking for work when he was murdered. We're also talking about the failures of American healthcare system and the repeated health crises that disproportionately affect Black people. So we're in the midst of a pandemic. I've mentioned that several times, and that's in part why we're so attuned to the moment. But when we think about the murder of George Floyd had COVID-19 in his lungs when he died. Right? So we can't avoid that either. We're also talking about the failures of an educational system for Black and brown people. There's a new study that just came out that shows that 40 to 60% of Black and brown students are falling behind or absent in remote learning. So there are inequities built into that system as well. And then finally, while this might be blasphemous for me to say in a public policy school or forum, right? We're also talking about the historical and continuing failures of public policy, public officials, and public institutions in the lives of Black people. So essentially, every single aspect of the state, of the American fabric has failed Black people and has failed Black people repeatedly. And that is where the protests are coming from. This is why somebody like George Floyd becomes symbolic of a movement. His death picks up on trends and highlights trends that we've literally seen for 400 plus years. So it's the inescapability of that potent mixture of racism and inequality that's built into the very fabric of our nation. And it's horrific in our inability to escape it, right? So that's what we're talking about. So what Black people have consistently used protests for and done through protests is to declare to the world that the system is not working and that we want to live. So this is why we often hear things like, I can't breathe, Black lives matter too, right? And this is also why I want to point out and highlight that why Black protest matters. We don't really talk about this larger context and history of Black protests. And I think I've given you a kind of a broad overview of what goes into Black protests. But I also want to point out, and this is actually part of a larger project that Dr. Megan Francis and I are working on, that Black protest makes the point quite clearly that the state is illegitimate. I'm going to repeat that again because it's really, really important. The state is illegitimate. And that is to say that the social contract which governs our lives and has historically failed Black people and continues to fail them, right? So the safeguards that we envision when we think or talk about American democracy has failed Black people. It doesn't work for Black people. It was never meant to include Black people. So what I would argue and what I would point out and what I want us to think about is that Black protest actually represents our best chance at a true democracy for all people, because it highlights the ways in which democracy actually doesn't work for very many people. So we can see it with the NAACP, we can see it with the civil rights movement, we can even see it with the Black Power movement, we can see it with the anti-apartheid movement, and of course, we can see it most vividly because it's in our lives right now and has been in our lives for at least the last 7 years with the movement for Black lives. So I'll stop here by saying, before I turn it over to the other panelists, by saying, I started off by noting that 4 years ago, we couldn't even say Black Lives Matters as a nation. But the fact that many people can now say Black Lives Matter, and that we're actually seeing not just rhetoric, although we are seeing a whole lot of rhetoric and not so much action, but the fact that we're actually seeing actions that re-envision power of the state, power of institutions, that even some corporations are looking inward to say, how can we be different? That white people are talking about how have we contributed to this harm and what can we do to change that harm, right? Actually is a whole church testament to the power of protest and power of Black protest in particular for all people in this country. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to our fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And first, I just want to say how thankful I am to be invited to speak with a group of such incredible Black women who are carving out space to speak to these issues that not only impact the way we think and understand policing and punishment, racism and democracy, but also really acknowledge and honor the people who are impacted by these systems every day. So I wanted to use this time to reflect on how policing is but one part of a deeply interwoven system of punishment and surveillance for many people who live in the United States, especially for Black people. So it shouldn't really be news that policing has existed in some form for centuries. And while the historical underpinnings of policing would not be recognizable today, the first forms of policing in the United States began as a social control mechanism for Black people and for other racially marginalized groups. So some people who write on this history, I'm thinking specifically about Christian Williams here, point to some of the earlier forms of policing in the United States, taking the forms of slave patrols who were created to capture and enslave Africans. And then in the Northeast, we had these Indian constables who were created to police Native Americans and then protect residents from them. And it wasn't really until the mid-19th century that police forces throughout the United States began to converge to a single model, with aspects such as 24-hour service and personnel who are paid by salary and not a fee. So as we see these informal modes of policing transformed into the modern police departments that we know, funding began to drastically change. If we were to just look at Boston as an example, in 1825, less than $9,000 or just 2% of the total city budget was allocated to all phases of policing, which included only 9 police officers. In contrast, today in Boston, it spends close to $420 million, or upward of 15% of its annual budget, and employs 2,200 police officers. And Boston still pales in comparison to other cities like Chicago, who spend in excess of 40% of their budget on policing, not to mention the billions that are made within the private sector from policing technologies. And there have been a number of studies recently by Alison Harris included who show that departments who are facing budget stress are associated with higher rates of citations and other offenses that carry fee punishments. So they're effectively relying on punishment to be able to continue their paychecks and uphold these systems. So as policing mushroomed to become what we see it is today, in recent decades, we've also seen a huge transfer of power from various state programs to either a policing model or directly to the police themselves. They are absolutely everywhere. In 2008, the Census of State and Local Law Enforcement Agencies reported that in addition to the 16,000 general enforcement agencies that we have, there are also additional 1,700 special jurisdictions. And that ranges from school police to public health special police. And so as these tough on crime measures were adopted in the criminal legal system during the 60s, they were also adopted into all of these other sectors. So as Professor Rigueur mentioned earlier, if we look at schooling in the 1960s and 70s, it was not common at all to have police in schooling. Less than 1% of schools reported ever having police officers in the school. But by the 90s, 54% of public schools reported having stationed law enforcement officers. And this punitive turn did not make schools safer at all, but it did lead to children, particularly Black children, to be funneled into the criminal punishment system and experience punishment en masse. And these racial disparities can be seen as early as preschool. And we know that these systems have democratic consequences. Veshla Weaver and Amy Lerman have spoken about how these increased contact with the carceral state serves as a socialization into democracy and the state. And some more recent studies have found that young adults who experience punishment in schools are much less likely to engage in voting or to volunteer in civic activities later in life. So as we've seen the policing increasing, we've seen school punishment increase, we've also seen in recent decades that funding of other social services have been completely slashed. The welfare reforms of the 90s meant that the safety nets available for people started to completely disappear. Participation in the SNAP program, or what is more commonly known as food stamps, fell by almost half, and that cannot be explained by declines in poverty alone. And then we see in the 90s that there has been a huge criminalization of Black parents and Black families. And we can see that in the tropes of the deadbeat dad or the welfare queen. And so we've seen Black families and Black people just being funneled and inserted into the carceral state. And this has happened in so many other systems, and it's been documented by scholars and community organizers. So in my own work, I've looked at how these various forms of punishment are completely piled onto Black communities in particular, and how it just becomes an enduring presence in every single aspect of their lives. Another point I think we should really think about is the ways that policing is absolutely a global phenomenon. The United States borrowed from the English model of policing, and the anti-Black practices that began in Britain and then were transported to the British colonies are still present in both systems. And today the United States have partnerships with a number of other countries, and where we are actively trying to export our mode of policing or our model of policing. So there are police professionalization programs between the US and Mexico, and there are international law enforcement academies in 85 countries throughout the world. So whatever we're doing in this country it does not stop at the borders, it goes far beyond. So I know I'm running out of time, but when people see these uprisings within Black communities, I think what's really important to remember is that the Black community is being policed in every single aspect of their lives. And then when we see these brutal murders of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd, of Tony McDade, and the countless others, we're recognizing that this system has been designed to and is still working to hurt us, and we just don't want to take it anymore. And this is a really exciting moment to see people start to take seriously the notion of abolition and see public officials start to respond to that. And so when we're talking about defunding or abolishing the police, it doesn't just mean the police departments in isolation. It means this entire system of policing. So it means taking money that has been increasingly funneled to the police and the carceral state and then reinvesting it in services that support communities, and to ensure that they don't turn to wealth extraction to try and make up for that money lost. And people who are working in community organizing spaces know this to be true, and that's why it is so important to take their lead to effectively dismantle this system. They've done the work to imagine a world without policing. They've done the work to look at how technologies and how data have further entrenched this system. And we shouldn't fall for this capitalism take on police reform that completely ignores the decades of work done by Black feminist abolitionists. Abolition is not about asking, what do we do without the police? It's about thinking of the number of possibilities that would come with the $120 billion that we don't spend on the police. And that's why I'm so excited that these conversations are arising. So I'll end here and pass it on to the next panelist.
Hi, everyone. I again want to start just by thanking Professor Francis and this powerhouse panel of Black doctors, y'all, professors, y'all. Like, it's an honor to be here, and it's so dope that y'all invited me. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to talking about the intersections between pandemics, policing, and protest. I think it's important to start by acknowledging, as many of you have, that we have a habit in this country of ritualizing forgetting, right? We are practiced in the habit of forgetting the history that so many of my colleagues on this panel are trying to remind us of. When we forget so often that we make it like a national pastime, when folks simply offer now to remember what has happened, we pretend that that's liberation. But I want to remind us from the start, what we are asking for today is not simply a remembering, it's reparations, it's remuneration. It is a shift in policies and resources that prioritize Black lives. Don't tell us Black Lives Matters if you can't show us in your institution and organization how they do, okay? So I wanna start there. Part of that forgetting started during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We saw the alarming emergence of racial health inequities in the pandemic. And many folks in the media and much of the public discussion centered around either individual behaviors of African Americans, blaming folks essentially for the fact that they were disproportionately suffering from this new virus, or around what we called underlying illness that Black people just magically had more of, or poverty. Those types of analysis were a part of our ritual forgetting of why Black people disproportionately suffer poverty and disease in this country. Just to take poverty off the top, right? So many folks, and Professor Rigueur already said this, right? Like African Americans had the lowest median income of any group in this country. And then if you map onto that, the current unemployment that has soared as a part of the economic downturn from COVID-19, that has predominantly affected African Americans. Our unemployment rate has not changed. Since April, it went up 0.1%. And I believe the most recent figure is 16.8% of African Americans are out of work. Just among those who lost work because of COVID-19, nearly half of African Americans lost their job, right? So poverty alone doesn't quite describe the impoverishment that has happened to African Americans as a result of how racism shapes their prospects for employment and equitable wages in this country. Underlying illness. Here we're going to make a connection between COVID and policing. So follow me if you can. Police violence is a health problem, and we have been saying it for decades. The Association of Public Health, the American Association of Public Health Officials have basically said since 1995, police violence is a public health problem. Why? Because number one, off top, police kill people. Nearly 1,000 people are killed by police in the United States every year, right? But if you don't die in that encounter, you also may be subject to injuries, disabilities, mental health impairments as a result. And some of the most profound data among the health effects regarding the health effects of police violence look at the effect on the population that witnesses that violence. So if you zoom out of the 1,000 people who might die in police encounters, we have to think of the exponential numbers who just experience force during a police encounters, which is much more common. And then you have to zoom out to anyone who witnessed that, either in person, on their cell phone, on the internet, or through a secondhand account. We have decades of research that tell us that witness violence accumulates in mental health impairments like depression, anxiety, PTSD, right? That usually we describe around like soldiers and leaving war, where you re-experience and you participate in hypervigilant behaviors to avoid that happening to you in the future. For kids, it can contribute to headaches, changes in your sleep patterns, changes in your behaviors, like in young children, increased irritability, or in teenagers, increased withdrawn behaviors or increased isolation. It also can affect the long-term health of populations because we know that chronic exposures to stress shift how the human body develops. It shifts infant brain development, lung and heart development. And as you become an adult, increases your risk of things like heart disease, lung disease, cancer, and mental health impairments like Alzheimer's and depression. So if we know police violence does all those things, and we know that African Americans disproportionately suffer the physical harms of police violence, You can't say that increased rates of COVID are simply underlying disease. Those underlying diseases are rooted in forms of structural racism like we're witnessing with police violence. And we have to make that connection and stop forgetting that that's how this came about. I think I also want to say a word specifically about the protests, because in the light of these intersections between various forms of institutional violence that live in our healthcare system, that live in our policing system, that live in our employment market, like in light of those intersecting forms of violence, we also have to think about protests then as a public health intervention. I said this on Twitter and I'll say it here now. Protest saves lives, especially Black protest, right? Black protest wasn't just about the Black liberation movement. It is the foundation of women's liberation, of queer liberation in this country. It is the foundation of the civil liberties and protections from discrimination that protect all of us when we leave our homes and try to use public systems or go to your workplace. And we have to understand the roots of civil unrest as the source of those protections. And when those protections provide greater equality, and when you're fighting for greater equality to save your lives, protest saves lives. So I also want to say that as a clinician and as a public health advocate, it is really important that we shift the framing that we're putting around protests. The last thing I'll say is a number of people have raised concerns and a number of journalists have asked me, well, will protesting increase risks of COVID in the population, particularly in the Black population who already had disparate rates of infection and death? First, I'll say the disparate rates of death are enormous. African Americans who live in majority Black areas have a 6 times higher death rate than white Americans who live in majority white areas. So it's 6 times higher. It's an enormous account. Like there was one estimate that more than actually 1 in 2,000 of all African Americans in this entire country have died of coronavirus. The effect of coronavirus on African Americans has been enormous. And so when people bring up these arguments, right, they try to pretend, right, and forget that there are so many forces that are threatening Black lives in this country. And they say, oh, but Black people shouldn't go outside because of the enormous risk of COVID. And I started with that data, so you know, I believe it is an enormous risk. But then you have to ask every person who asked you that every person who asked you that question, every journalist, every public health official, like, what are the enormous risks that are compounding Black folks that despite that 6 times increased risk of death, they would still go to the street? Right? That's what we have to be asking ourselves. And there are so many risks that we are compounding historically and currently in our practices in healthcare, in our workforce, right, across the state that we need to be confronting and thinking about. And that's what protest is enabling us to do.
Woo! So I was muted most of the time. But I'm over here banging the table. So many good points were raised. I always learn so much from all of you. I want to just highlight a few things just very quickly because I don't want to leave them, even though there's going to be a video, which I will return to and assign to some future students. One, remembering is not liberation. Oh my goodness, that's like the title of a book. The failure of technocratic policy solutions. Yes, absolutely. The interlocking political institutions that feed the system and how it doesn't just stop at our borders, right? About how we also export the carceral system. Protest as public health intervention. I want to read the article. The transformation of Black Lives Matter from 2014 to where we are here in 2020. Okay, so with these comments are so rich. They have helped us paint a more clear picture of the present moment. However, one of the refrains that I'm hearing from Black friends, colleagues, and community members is that more needs to happen than just listening and learning, that our responsibility in the present moment is to do something. So I want to move this conversation to think about a question that the civil rights icon Ella Baker proposed, which is, how do we confront injustice collectively? If the present does not work, what else is possible? What is something that would dramatically transform the present that could meaningfully contribute to power and capacity building for Black people, for this country? I'm going to go in. I know Kaneesha mentioned abolition. So is that okay if I do Kaneesha, Rhea, and then Leah this time? And I'm about 2 to 3 minutes to answer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I alluded to this at the end of what I was saying earlier. I think that the next step should be looking at the community organizers who are working in community. They understand the history of the different locales across the US of how to effectively dismantle this system. So one thing that I want to uplift is a group of abolitionist organizers put together a campaign called 8 to Abolition. And I think that it perfectly describes the steps that we need to do next. And what I love in particular about this is that they acknowledge that police abolition is not just abolishing the police. It's about fixing housing, it's about fixing schooling, it's about fixing all of these systems that the police have trickled into. So I think it's very clear that we've put all of our money into these politicians, into these decision makers that just are distributing it wrong, and they're putting it into the wrong places. So I think that we need to take the money out of them, out of these systems, pass it on to these community organizers who know where to redistribute it in order to keep the communities safer. Yeah, that's my very short answer.
Great. Rhea?
Yeah, so I'll take 2 takes on this. I think as a pediatrician, I think one thing that I'm going to be pushing really hard for is police-free schools. I think, Kaneesha, you set this up so beautifully, that we pretend again that like the current use of police in our schools is the way that schools have always been, or that there is data that suggests that it makes kids safer at school to have the police there, and that simply isn't true. The data, as Kaneesha well summarized, says that the more police you have in schools, not only are kids at risk for harms and violence that some of us have witnessed, videoed, and shared on social media of kids while they're in the classroom, but also just the increased expulsions and arrests and suspensions from school that, again, predominantly affect Black children, Latinx children, Indigenous children, and we can no longer have that. So we need to promise our kids that we will give them a learning environment that is free of the violence and surveillance of police. I'll also say that we in healthcare have an enormous amount of work to do. So one of the 8 to Abolition, like part of the conversation we're now having about abolition is we need to defund the police, and in its place, we need to place healthcare, essentially, right? We need more mental health officials, we need more social workers, we need more care models that can then take the place of the crisis network that police used to provide. But, you know, I'm sorry to say, we in healthcare are absolutely not ready to take that role. When you think about histories and current practices of structural and physical violence against Black and Brown folks and their bodies, that has long lived in healthcare, and it continues to live today. Don Berwick, who is kind of like one of our huge health policy minds in healthcare, who now works at IHI and thinks about quality improvement, he's always quoted as saying, like, basically any problems that we have in healthcare, usually he says this around quality, are a form or tell us not that the system is broken, but actually that it's working as designed. And I use that when I talk about health disparities a lot. Health inequities are not a sign that the system is broken. When you have racial health inequities, that is actually a product of our system working as intended. So if we know that our system can so reliably and systematically create decade after decade, generation after generation, gaps in healthcare outcomes, including gaps in premature mortality, where African Americans have the second highest mortality of any group in this country, second only to Indigenous populations. For decades, Black Americans had the highest mortality rate, but for the last 5 years, Indigenous populations have the highest mortality rate. And I also have to say, have high rates of police violence and police killings. We know that we as a healthcare system have allowed that to happen right under our noses, right? When we know, and not just right under our noses, with our help. If you know that Black women who want to have babies have a 2 to 3 times higher risk of dying within that first year of having their baby? When you know Black infants, before they reach their first year of life, have a 2 times risk of dying, that's not something that lives aside of our healthcare system. That's at the root of how we deliver care, of who we say is worthy of that care and the dignity with which we provide it. And so as we talk about further changes that need to happen and shifting to a health-centered or a wellness-centered or a care-centered crisis response network, we also have to talk about the immense amount of changes that we have to make in healthcare to ensure that when we are entrusted with caring for Black bodies, we do a much better job than we're doing right now.
Okay, so I just first want to give a shout out to Kaneesha and Rhea because they have just answered this question quite beautifully. And so what I'm going to try and do in order to add to the conversation is to talk a little bit more generally, particularly around actionable items that people who are watching right now can actually do in their day-to-day lives. But I also want to preface that by saying that there is no solution that we're talking about that isn't going to take an enormous amount of time. Right? We're quite literally talking about generations, centuries of inequality compounded over time. And so any solution that we're looking for, even though I know a lot of people on here are like, quick, give me something that I can do. Any solution that we're talking about is actually going to take investment, is going to take work, and most importantly, is going to take time. So we have to think about this as a long game, as a marathon, something that we are working towards constantly. And there is no quick fix solution. With that said, there are things that maybe I'd like to call survival actions that you can do. Right? So there are things that we can do in the immediate that will have an immediate impact, but also will work towards the long run, these long-term solutions, and really overturning racial inequality and other forms of inequality, particularly economic inequality, and will have measurable impacts for us to change the world. So the first thing that we can do is, in terms of like survival items, is talk about goal setting. And what are the goals that we have in mind, or the goals that we can achieve that are achievable in the short term? And that comes in many different forms, right? So it could be something as as easy as local voting, right? Which also does matter, but it could also be contributing resources, contributing money to bail out protesters. It could be something like volunteering your time, whether it be at a march, whether it be at a center, whether it be in the larger community. And so there are a whole host of things. I think Dr. Boyd pointed out a very good point about like how there are actionable items in terms of removing police officers from schools, right? That's something that can be accomplished now. And in fact, we saw that the Minneapolis Community Council voted unanimously to remove police officers from schools. So that is something that has immediate results. I also want to point out, highlight that Kaneesha argued and pointed out this concept of defunding the police. And I think one of the actionable items, although we have to be vigilant about how it's parceled out, is we see this in a place like Los Angeles and several other locales, which have said, we are going to pull money out of this bloated budget that we've set aside for policing and put it and reinvest it into Black communities most harmed by these policings. Now, part of the reason I think we have to be vigilant there is because when we look at the size of the budget, right, and the way in which money is allocated, it actually may not, $150 million may not actually be a lot of money. So, but part of what we can do is support and advocate for measures like that. The second thing I would say is education and enrichment. And I'm not talking about listen to a podcast or read a book, although you should do that too. What I'm actually talking about is educating yourself, right, on these issues, and then educating others. And I'm actually going to put this challenge out to white people, because I think Black people have been doing this, for their entire lives. It is part of their life. It is part of their identity. So I'm going to say the real challenge is for white people to actually come and think about what it means to be educated and to be enriched on these ideas, and to then spread these ideas within their community. The bigger thing I think to think about here is what actually does it mean to expand our imagination of what is possible? That is what education and enrichment actually helps us do. And so part of that is turning our attention to the people on the ground, and I think Kaneesha and Rhea both mentioned this, but the people on the ground who have been doing this work for generations, in particular, Black women activists and Black women protesters who have been doing this for now centuries. I mean, Megan pointed out Ida B. Wells. That's not a fluke. That's actually part of a feature of how Black women's activism has really defined itself through this country. So there are ways in which we can turn to the people who are doing the work and acknowledge them and go to them and look to them for solutions, but also to really just expand our understanding of what, and really wrestle with what is possible. What can we do creatively? And then the last thing is actually a concrete, immediate thing that people can do within their own organizations. You know, I know right now it is fashionable for corporations to put out and institutions to put out statements about Black Lives Matter, we stand, we support, systemic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But part of that is we also know that it's good for the market, right? Good for corporations. A better instance would be to actually look within the organization and saying, what am I actually doing tangibly to make sure and ensure that Black lives matter, that Black lives are protected, that Black lives are not harmed, and that I am not actively doing harm to those Black lives. And the sad thing is, I think right now, is that a lot of corporations, including those corporations that are saying, yes, Black lives matter, actually aren't doing that internal legwork. Talk to your Black employees, because your Black employees are not okay. So those are a couple of things that you can do, that we can all do to, get free.
Excellent. So I just want to, I want to amplify a point, a reflection, and then a quick comment here. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here. One about the importance here of acknowledging the work done before, right? That I think for me, one of the things that's interesting is seeing some of these new possible policy proposals that are coming forth around police reform, or these kind of lukewarm that are not really abolition, but are dressed up as. But I think it's really important that we focus on those fighters: Ida B. Wells, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Survived and Punished, Critical Resistance. These organizations and these Black women, Indigenous feminists who have long used different forms and strategies around harm reduction, around accountability, right? That we look to those and we call those forth, right? Organizations at our schools, the Harvard Divestment Campaign, at the University of Washington, where I'm at, there has been longstanding organizations focused on disarming the police, focused on decarceration. So, I mean, I think that's important that people look out in terms of wherever they are, where their kids go to school, and think about and try to connect with the organizations and the organizers who've been there a long time. A reflection on what Dr. Boyd mentioned around schools, something that I actually spent a little bit this morning. I tweeted about the Seattle Teachers Union voted to end, and I'm not sure, I don't think it's official yet, but to end Seattle police officers in schools. And as somebody who did K through 12 public schools, it's weird for me because I obviously work in this area now, but I realized somewhere in college, in the nice manicured hedges of Rice University in Houston, Texas, that it was weird that it was weird to be in a place without a very strong police presence. That part of the naturalizing in my mind around the police, the normalization, is that I saw them everywhere. When I walked in the school building, during classes, after classes, at school dances, that they were just everywhere. And I'm very excited about a possibility for me, a Garfield High School without that, right? And then at the same time, the other part of my tweet was that there was one guidance counselor for the entire class of 450 students, right? So that already kind of let us know what was actually valued and what was important. The last thing I'll say here in terms of, I think, what's really important to also focus on this point of not just institutions or not just corporations, but also institutions with all these statements, is to look internally and to figure out like what you have done in the past. It's not just about moving forwards, but I think part of the work in terms of moving forwards is to reckon with the past forms of racial injustice, right? And I'm thinking here, top of mind right now, who have profited off of Black people is the music industry and the sports industry, right? It's not enough just to say that we recognize that Black people matter and we're going to do more work in the present, right? But do you pay your artists appropriately? Do you pay your graphic designers appropriately, right? Do you pay your athletes and their agents that are Black appropriately? And if not, then you need to think about like talk to those people and to try to rectify the wrongs that have happened in the past. So I think that also should be part of that. I want to go now to the Q&A from the audience. I see a lot of really, really great questions. One thing that I think a number of us touched on in our comments that I want to pull out, Karita Brown, who is an incredible sociologist at UCLA, asked in the questions, what does this moment mean for ushering through a comprehensive reparations bill? Many states are proposing them. What does history tell us about how to push through racial justice legislation? Anybody willing to take that?
So I'll jump in. I'm just going to say something really quick, and then I would actually encourage Dr. Francis to jump in a little bit here too, particularly with her knowledge of the NAACP and the different ways that they have advocated and successfully advocated for change. The first is that historically reparations for Black people has been an extremely uncomfortable topic for the rest of the nation, but in particular white people, and that there is very little, if any, support for reparations for white people. With that said, I am deeply heartened at the fact that during the 2020 presidential primaries, several of the candidates, including Castro, including Cory Booker, including Elizabeth Warren, actually had platforms that included reparations, right? So prior to this, it has even been just a debate to get a conversation going about reparations. And here we now have several of the candidates actually discussing this. What I would say is that one of the things that protest has shown over this longer historical record is that now, a moment like now, is actually really good for pushing through the kind of racial transformative legislation that could actually make a difference. And also that point I said earlier about thinking imaginatively and thinking creatively, one of the ways that we can do this, and I think Dr. Boyd pointed this out too, is that reparations isn't simply like what people think it is, right? A cash payment or something like that, but actually it's reinvestment into the very communities that have been harmed by these policies, or people that have plundered these Black communities and exploited them for so long. So now is the kind of perfect moment to really have this conversation and also push people who have long been uncomfortable with the conversation and with the idea of reparations to think imaginatively and think largely about what reinvestment into communities that have been harmed actually looks like.
I also, amazing, I agree with everything. And just one small thing that I want to add on is that reparations have been done in many other parts of the world. In the UK, there was the biggest government payout was to formerly, to slave owners, and they recognized that they would end up losing all of this money once slavery was abolished. And so it's just I think what we have to think about now is, it's being done for certain groups of people. Why can't we just do it for this group of people? So I think it's really trying to think of the benefactors of this, of reparations as we're talking about it now, and just recognize that it has been done, and why are we not doing it for Black people in America?
Okay, I'm going to go to another question here. In terms of this question is about the longevity of the movement. What are we doing, or what can we do to ensure that this is a long-term shift, a durable shift, and not a moment that people forget next month, next year?
I could say a couple of things. I think you guys have done a great job of setting up for the audience all of the work that has gone to take us to this place, all of the language and all of the blood and sweat and other forms of protest that had to happen before this current generation could even have the word abolition in their mouths. So I think we are so grateful to that work, and it speaks to the arc at which this progress will happen. I think we are trying to push forward and lock in a new set of laws that push us a little bit forward so that the next generation could take it even further. But I would like to challenge those of you who hold positions of power, and to think broadly about what power means, whether you are in a role to hire folks in your organization, whether you're a recruiter, whether you work directly with community and have power over their access to the resources you can provide. those who are in positions of power, ask yourselves, how willing are you to ensure that your job looks totally different tomorrow and into the future forever? I think we all have to be willing to take on a certain amount of sacrifice of the way of what we used to call normal and the way that we used to interact with the world, because the change that we're bringing about isn't just like a law is going to change and then that'll trickle down into our lives. It's like you could change now before the law even changes. Like there's no reason most of our workforce has to be predominantly white at this point. There's no reason the highest unemployment rates have to be among African Americans right now. You can do that without a law forcing you to do it. And I hope people will. I'll also say, the last thing I'll say is, I think Professor Rigueur, you brought this up, like this is a multiracial movement. And I think it's why it's so powerful right now. It's not just Black folks in the streets. Folks who called themselves allies are actually surrendering their advantage and standing next to folks, literally risking their own health and wellness, right? Literally risking the physical harms of tear gas and arrest and all of the confrontation that's happening with police right now. And I think that really matters. And so I also want to ask people, as much as you can, to continue to do that. The fact that I think this is so strong is because it's multiracial, and the longevity of this moment depends on our ability to continue to foster this multiracial movement.
Leah or Kaneesha?
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick and say that, you know, one of the things that Dr. Francis asked us to think about before this panel is, she was like, what makes you optimistic? And I have to say, there are two things that really make me optimistic, particularly for this idea of long-term change. One is the involvement and the leadership of young people on these issues. They are at the forefront. I mean, largely, protest movements have largely been led by young people, but the extraordinary energy and kind of just imagination and vision that young people have been displaying in this moment is exhilarating. It is exciting. And, you know, these are individuals who aren't necessarily brand names. They're not in your, you know, they're not on your TVs, they're not in your homes, but to see them actually going out and doing the work, understanding the risks, but still willing to do the work should be inspirational for all of us. And then the second thing is, I really just want to echo and reinforce what Dr. Boyd said, which is that this is a multiracial movement. And we've seen people jump in who just 4 years ago, right? 3 years ago, just wouldn't be in this protest, wouldn't be in this uprising, wouldn't be in this rebellion in ways that we're seeing right now. So it does give me optimism to see, in particular, white people actually really questioning the kind of role that they can play, but also questioning the kind of harm that they have done in the past, and then what they can do to rectify this. And I think sustaining that kind of relationship is going to be crucial to sustaining any kind of long-term, and I mean long-term movement.
We are almost at time, so I actually think that that's a great place to kind of do a quick round robin in terms of this question about what gives you optimism and what gives you hope. Can I do Kaneesha, Dr. Boyd, and Leah, if you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I'm just going to echo everything all the wonderful words that have been said so far. I am really motivated by the courage of young people. So just not just their involvement, but their ability to stand up and question these systems of injustice and power that need to be dismantled. And then also just the intergenerational conversation that's happening. You have people who've been involved in previous movements, talking to young people, sharing ideas and recognizing this time for new ideas to enter the realm.
You know, I'm going to be honest, I always struggle with the hope question and the optimism question. And it's not because I'm pessimistic, but it is because this has been a long time coming. And if you've been saying these things as folks like I have, and you've hit a wall, you worry about that wall coming back up. And I worry about that. I actually worry about the backlash to what this moment is right now. I worry about the people who are organizing just as hard as we're organizing to keep the status quo in place, or maybe even retrench it even further. So I have a lot of concerns. I think it's why many of us are up at night. It's why we feel like we're sprinting in this marathon, and why we're kind of frankly exhausted. I think I do want to say something positive, though. I will say I feel grateful for this space right here. I think I never thought Harvard Kennedy School would invite a person like me to a platform like this to start talking about abolition. And that I think is good. I similarly, in some of my organizations, like the American Academy of Pediatrics, have been able to have conversations about police violence that I've wanted to have for years right now. And people seem more ready. And maybe that also is good. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm going to work so that my work can give other people hope. And I'm going to be looking out there at all of y'all's work to also give me hope that we are moving forward.
I just want to say quickly, I want to echo what the panelists said, but I also want to give a shout out, I think, to the people that are doing the work, particularly, highlighted in this panel. That gives me an enormous amount of optimism. And I'm not just talking about people on the ground, although people on the ground and these organizers have been doing this work for generations. But, I'm really buoyed by kind of like the work that Kaneesha Johnson is doing, for example, or the work that Rhea Boyd is doing, and then the work that Megan Francis is doing. And it's just such a pleasure to be able to actually have conversations about that in this place, and then have all of you out there listening and be able to kind of implement, ideally, hopefully, a lot of the suggestions and a lot of the ideas that we have, that we've suggested here today, because that's how you make change, right? That's the first step for making change. And I really look forward to more of these conversations and more of these actionable things that we can do in the future.
Yeah, so I think I'll end on saying just I so appreciate you all for gathering here on the Zoom and for having this conversation. When I was approached by the Ash Center, it wasn't that we want you to do this. It was that, hey, would you be interested, like basically meeting me a little bit about where I was. And the only thing that I could think about is that I wanted to hear from Black women in different areas about their work, about how they were understanding and how they were working in this moment. And I'm just like, my soul at least feels filled today because I've been so exhausted. Like Rhea was saying, I've just been so tired, and it has been a sprint because so many of us in the academy, outside of the academy, have been working on raising these issues for a very long time. And it feels that there's this moment and we don't want to let any of that moment slip through our fingers, right? Because we always know that the other side is organizing, right? To stop the amount of progress that has happened. That's what also the history of American politics tells us. But I will say, in terms for me, what gives me hope is teaching. Teaching this year, Race and Equality in American Democracy, as well as Philanthropy and Social Movements, Will the Revolution Be Funded? And in both those courses, I taught about abolition to a group of students in both courses who were like, huh, what? And that really, though, like throughout the course, developed a really critical analysis of the criminal punishment system in this country, as well as their duty to think differently, to imagine differently, and to watch my students' minds change from accepting something as is presented to them to questioning the foundations of them and how it impacts other people around them, I find really, really just invigorating. Also, just really want to shout out the work of LaTosha Brown of Black Voters Matter. And in part, I'm saying that because there's so many organizations who have been doing the work. This is something that we've heard echo from this panel for years. Black women-led, who have challenged us and have already helped us to radically imagine what a future looks like in which Black people are actually treated equally and are valued in our society. So just really wherever you are out there in the world, to try to connect with those people and those organizations. From the Ash Center at Harvard Kennedy School, we really want to thank you for being here, and my deep, deep gratitude to the panelists today. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you another day.